Okay, a very warm welcome to everyone. We're just about to start this week's CGHE webinar. My name's David Mills, and it's just gone 2 p.m. in the UK. It's a real pleasure to be welcoming Isaac Kamola today from Trinity College. Isaac has been doing some really interesting work ever since his doctoral dissertation, which wasn't on the Rwanda genocide, but ended up being about the US universities and production of the global imaginary. And I think for our audience, thinking about the history of this global imaginary feels very important as we work and support work that tries to address global higher education. So as normal, I will just introduce the webinar format. You know me, I'm David Mills. I'm director of the centre, and we have a weekly webinar every Tuesday, 2 p.m. UK time. We always record them, and we will make them available tomorrow or soon afterwards on the website and the slides as well, when there are slides. So please make use of that archive. It's a great archive, and I have almost 470 webinars and transcripts and slides, so lots there to explore. As usual, I suggest you keep yourself muted, no need to have the video on, and ask questions in the chat along the way. Any comments you have along the way, great, put them in the chat. And then after half an hour or so, Isaac will then ask questions, and we can have a conversation for the next half an hour. Brilliant. Okay, so we have almost 30 people here now. Isaac, I think people are getting really excited about your work, and you may well want to talk about your new Centre for Academic Freedom, but for today we're going to focus on the global imaginary and the role of US universities in that. Isaac, the screen's yours.
Great. Thanks so much, David, for having me. And this is a great audience that I'm really excited to present this work. My book, Making the World Global, US Universities and the Production of the Global Imaginary, came out in May of 2019. And a few months later, you may remember there was a little world event that kind of shut down the ability to go and talk about my book in front of audiences. There was a global pandemic. And it's really nice to be able to come out and talk with you all. I'm going to focus my talk today on kind of like the theoretical underpinnings of the book. The book is very much written as an empirical story. It's based on 6 chapters that take 6 different kind of empirical cases. And I think that it can be read as an empirical story and be quite compelling. But it's actually a theoretical argument that kind of is under the surface or below the hood, if you will. And what I want to do is kind of tease out that theoretical argument. And basically what the theoretical argument is that it's really helpful, I think, and really accurate to think about universities as sites of production and reproduction, right? So we tend to think of ourselves as kind of creating knowledge, discovering truth. But what I'm really interested in is thinking about what knowledge is produced and also reproduced, and therefore to kind of rethink about the universities as sites of world making. And here, kind of theoretically, I don't want to get too into the details because this is when I get into trouble, but it's kind of a strange kind of theoretical effort to bring together a structural Marxist approach that's greatly influenced by the work of Althusser together with a kind of decolonial approach, and this kind of weird combination. I'm more than happy to talk about what that looks like, but I don't think we need to go there. But so what I want to do is to first of all just situate where the project came from, and kind of the questions that were motivating it, because I think that thinking about universities as sites of world making, it might be helpful to think about what world was I deeply enmeshed in when I came up with this project. So I was starting my dissertation at the University of Minnesota in the late 2010s, and in the field of international relations. I kind of stumbled into the discipline of international relations. By the mid 2000s, I was fumbling around trying to figure out what I was going to write my dissertation on. I thought for a while it was going to be on the genocide in Rwanda. Then I became very active in campus union activity around a really great union called ASME 3800, which was the clerical workers. I worked on graduate student organizing and a bunch of other campus events. And basically what I would find myself doing is I would spend all day kind of with the union activists on the picket line or occupying buildings. And then I would go to my office in the evening or go back home and try to figure out what I was going to write my dissertation on. And I was kind of making all of these strategic calculations. And it was a time in which globalization was becoming a major discourse, or had emerged as a major discourse within the field of international relations. So I kept thinking, my advisor is saying I don't have the language expertise, that the funding is drying up to do work in Rwanda, that there's a lack of interest, and globalization is kind of this concept that's ascendant. Maybe I should shift my focus onto to thinking about globalization. And in that context, I began to kind of spending the time on the picket line with the clerical workers. This is Phyllis Walker here, who is the president of ASME 3800, who's an amazing speaker. I still get like goosebumps thinking about her speeches on the picket line. But just kind of spending all my time around people who really understood how universities worked in very, very concrete ways. We bring cultural studies faculty to the picket lines and to rallies to give their talks, and they would just talk in this way about a university that was very abstract and unreal. And it was the clerical workers who were really talking about the university as it worked and as it functioned, right? And I was beginning to think that like these two things were actually the same issue, right? That there was a university that's a material that functions in very, very concrete ways. And then there was me trying to decide what my dissertation topic was, concerned about, am I going to be able to write a project that I can get a job, that I can pay my bills, I can feed my family, and put a roof over my on my house. So what I want to do is just kind of read a little bit from the preface of the book that kind of sets up this problematic. Only in retrospect did it become obvious, did the obvious become evident, that the dissertation I ultimately wrote could not be disaggregated from the material conditions within which I was writing. Later, when applying for academic jobs in the years immediately following the 2008 financial crisis, it continued to be abundantly clear that writing about some things and not others was directly affecting access to funding, professional opportunities, and full-time employment. However, while these very practical financial and strategic relationships profoundly shaped what I was writing, they often remain unspoken. I came to see the systemic failure to acknowledge the material relationships making academic practices possible as enabling of the vision of the academy as a 0 point, in the words of Walter Mignolo, that detaches a 0 point, that is a detached vantage from which one can falsely claim to look out, describe, and understand a world as it exists out there. If we reject the notion of the university as a 0 point, what we might call an Archimedean point, and understand colleges and universities as instead worldly institutions, then we must also take seriously the fact that the institutions of higher education are also particular provincial and embedded sites of political and economic struggle. However, even in such acknowledgments, there remains a deep desire to imagine universities as universal. After all, it is only from the lofty vantage point that one can write, think, study, and teach about the world as an abstraction, knowable from a point of transcendence. It becomes possible to talk about politics, democracy, or class as concepts and ideas, rather than, as we learned on the picket line, very real, complex, and unsolvable conflict with very real consequences that ultimately cannot be resolved by the well-argued piece of prose or around a seminar table. Imagining the university as a 0 point, in other words, makes it possible to fool ourselves that as students and scholars, we inhabit an immaculate perch that invests our academic practices as either engaged in an apolitical quest for truth or as the fountain of critical political engagement playing out at the level of ideas. However, the hard lesson I learned through practice was that universities and colleges do not exist as detached from some real world, but rather are themselves always structured and structuring, produced and reproduced, and profoundly intertwined in the world, or more accurately, within a plurality of worlds. The university is a real world, just like, it's not like we don't go to school in order to prepare for a real world that exists after college. Instead, the university is a real world, just like the sweatshops, the plantation, and the shop floor. However, unlike t-shirts, sugar cane, and automobiles, the primary things being reproduced within the worlds of higher education, in addition to disciplined and indebted students, educated citizens, and skilled workers, are knowledge, expertise, and imaginaries. The book, therefore, then sets out kind of a case study, right? So it says, okay, if we think about the world as sites of production and reproduction of the world, as a sites of world making, what is one example of how that world making process takes place? So in the book, I look at that language that was so seductive in the 2010s, the language of globalization. And so the book is framed around the question, what is the massive expansion of global speak a symptom of? So what are the material conditions that give rise to academic discourse around globalization? That's just some themes there. So basically, what I did is just to think about the language. I kind of start by looking at globalization and say there's a tendency to think of globalization as a construct or an abstraction that scholars sit in the world in the university and look out at the world and say the world is becoming more global. You know, in the 1990s and 2000s, there's just this ton of literature about globalization. What is it? How new is it? Where it comes from? What it's doing? Is it economic, cultural, social? Just this whole like expanse of literature about what globalization is, right? And basically, what I do in the book is to basically say, instead of thinking about what globalization is, because that assumes that there's an expert looking out at the world and saying, "Aha, this is globalization." There's a concept and there's a world. How closely does a concept and world correspond with each other? And instead, I want to think, how is it that the language of globalization became such a salient topic in the ways that it did at a particular a moment in time? And in order to do this, I rely on this idea of the imaginary, right? The globalization is not a concept, right? But is actually an imaginary, or rather, there's something called a global imaginary that is produced and reproduced within higher education, of which the academic literature on globalization is a symptom. So let me just kind of unpack that through an example. I became really interested in this discourse of globalization, starting with an observation that there is this really odd paradox, right? During this time, the 1990s and 2000s, there was unanimous consensus that the world was global, right? That the world was globalizing, that was inevitable, that was unquestionable. And at the same time, so much of the academic literature started with the recognition of, yeah, we don't quite know what globalization is, or globalization is a sticky concept, it's hard to define, etc. Right? So there's this sincere, clean, and absolute claim that globalization is happening, while a recognition that we don't know what globalization is. So I argue that this is because there's what's called a global imaginary that is different from the concept of globalization. So what does that look like? So let's just use this example of the KOF Globalization Index, which is kind of a yearly index. And basically it measures the level of globalization. So it treats globalization as a phenomenon out in the world that can be measured by scholars, kind of collecting all these data points. And the data points that they collected are levels of foreign and direct investment, portfolio investment, telephone subscriptions, number of international airports by country, the levels of international tourism in a particular country, the number of foreign students, that include the per capita number of McDonald's and IKEA stores, et cetera, right? So when you take their rankings, you get something that looks like this, right? Where you get Switzerland, it's a KOF, rankings are based in Switzerland, so it's kind of, you know, not surprising that Switzerland comes out on top, and then the Netherlands and a bunch of European countries, Iraq, Cayman Islands, Afghanistan, etc., rank quite low on this particular set of rankings. But what I want to say is, what happens if instead of that list of IKEA stores and McDonald's and international tourism, what happens if we use a number of equally applicable ways to understand or of indicators or data points? Like, what happens if we used instead the number of offshore banking accounts or the presence of foreign troops occupying your country, right? Why is it that certain things are imagined as global and other things like, you know, foreign occupation or offshore banking accounts are not imagined as global, right? Then that creates what goes into the data that becomes that makes a claim about what globalization is. And the fact that that McDonald's and IKEA stores are imagined as global then becomes kind of the raw material, or the kind of the imaginary that makes the particular discourse about globalization as possible, right? So there's one kind of example of what globalization, kind of the way that globalization as a concept works, right? Is that there is this kind of complicated beast that's in the room, and that different scholars are studying different aspects of it, right? The blind scholars touching the elephant, saying, "Oh, this is what globalization is. This is what globalization is." McDonald's stores, the number of airports, tourism, right? And then out of that kind of aggregation, you get a picture of what that whole is. And so what this image is based on is this idea that there is something in the room, an elephant, that is being touched and measured and understood in various ways. But all of those then come to become knowledge about what that thing is, what that beast in the room is. But thinking about the global imaginary in terms of production and reproduction looks slightly different, right? Instead of starting from the assumption that there is an empirical thing, an elephant in the room, it would instead start like this. This is a picture of my office, the same one I'm sitting in now, at a time in which my office was much cleaner. I'm really glad that you can't see what the heck I'm looking at, because it's quite a mess, right? So, but basically, sitting in my office, the scholar looks at their office, or looks at the world around them more generally, and says, "Here's my coffee from South Africa, my green tea from China. Here's the hat I got well in Trinidad. Here's my personal electronics that were manufactured in China. The internet that's bringing a world a connectivity together." You take all of these things that happen to be in the room, right? And then imagine them as all part of the same thing. Imagine them as part of the same beast, right? So that the elephant comes to inhabit the room because of all the things that are being aggregated or understood. And so then the question becomes, whatever is created to create that room, to place things and to populate that thing in the room, right, becomes the things that are available to imagine what the global is. So that's kind of like the theoretical kind of construct, right? As we think about universities as sites of production and reproduction, then what is materially available to be studied is an important part of that, and that the imaginary, how things come to be imagined, right, is based on what is available. So therefore, it's not surprising that those in Switzerland have certain assumptions about what constitutes global. They design a ranking a system that produces knowledges about levels of globalization. So what does this kind of look like in the form of the book, right? In the book, it is a multi-decade and multi-sided story focusing on individual thinkers and the institutions that they inhabit, and the imaginaries rendered possible within those institutions. The book looks primarily at the American higher education, but offers a contrapuntal examination of universities in Africa, demonstrating that the kind of production of, or the emergence of, the global American university was built in relationship to the massive expansion of African higher education during the mid 20th century, and then its defunding and structural adjustment, right? The book is organized into 3 sections. The first section kind of examines the production of social scientific knowledge in the decades following World War II. And I argue in these 2 chapters, chapter 1 and chapter 2, that during this time, the imaginary that was being produced was very much a national imaginary. The Cold War University worked closely with philanthropic organizations, the federal government, and financial institutions to produce the conditions in which it was possible to imagine, not only possible, but incentivized to imagine a world as divided into discrete nation states, organized into an international system with states and units moving towards the common end, i.e. liberal democracy and liberal capitalism, and with the United States at the center of that. So in the first chapter, I look at the rise of modernization theory and situating that specifically within the work of Rostow and the Center for International Studies at MIT, and looking at all of the kinds of funding, the way that people were brought together, the kinds of conversations and books that, and materials that were published, the grants that were applied for, in order to show the conditions in which the idea of the world as an amalgamation of nation states were within an international system. And this then kind of is part of the story of the emergence of area studies, international studies, and the development of modernization theory, to name a number of academic kind of developments during that period. There was considerable material conditions that gave rise to the production of what I call a national imaginary. So, for example, in chapter 2, I look at how the modernization theory developed by Rostow and his colleagues at MIT moved into the World Bank, and how that led to a national development strategy under Robert McNamara, who kind of conceptualized the World Bank as pushing national development and national economic development, in which higher education, or education in general, but also higher education, was incredibly important to the project of national development, and manpower planning. During this time, the McNamara Bank supported a massive expansion of higher education, arguing that it benefited national development and reduced poverty. And this led to just a huge expansion of higher education across the African country, for example. So in across African universities between 1960 and 1980, university enrollments increased nearly 11% every year, with higher education accounting for, on average, nearly 20% of educational spending. And the result was the kind of creation of really, really important intellectual sites for the production of knowledge in a kind of post-colonial, anti-colonial African context at Makerere, University of Nairobi, University of Dar es Salaam, and across the continent. Really important universities and sites of knowledge production, again tied into oftentimes the project of independence, of national liberation, of national economic development. So section 2 kind of examines two nodes in which the kind of national imaginary kind of began to be replaced, or the emergence of a global imaginary. Chapter 3, I'll talk more about that in a second, but it examines Theodore Levitt's seminal essay from 1983, The Globalization of Markets, and how those ideas about the globalization of markets moved from Harvard Business School into the broader business world. And then the second chapter in this section looks at the World Bank under A.W. Clausen, who replaced McNamara, and the way that he replaced the concept of higher education as committed to national economic development, and replaced it instead with the idea of human capital. And so higher education being an individual commodity that one buys on a global market, and how this led, or kind of was kind of part of the conditions that kind of became structural adjustment policies that then had a devastating effect on higher education in Africa. The third section kind of examines this nation global imaginary that was kind of circulating in the 1980s, and the way that it kind of became reinforced and reproduced. So chapter 5 examines the defunding of area studies and the replacing it with kind of international studies and global studies, looking particularly at the Social Science Research Council and the ways in which their funding priorities shifted based on a number of internal conditions and external conditions. And again, like, that's an interesting chapter, because instead of saying the world is becoming more global, therefore we need to study the world, or we need to fund global projects. It was also tied into kind of funding problems within the organization and a bunch of other kind of institutional conditions that really kind of redefined the contours of area studies. And then the last chapter, which is a chapter I really didn't want to write, but every time I told people about the book project, they said, "So you're writing about NYU, right?" And so this chapter examines kind of how NYU under John Sexton and this idea of creating a global network university is kind of the natural extension of what happens when Theodore Levitt and the global imaginary become adopted and absorbed completely within the university, where the kind of the university not only embraces but doubles down on that notion that it is a global institution that imagines itself and what it does in almost entirely global terms. So taken together, these 6 chapters don't provide a straight line, but rather a series of intersected points. They attempt to demonstrate how particular individuals working within specific worlds come to imagine the world differently, how the institutions in which they work shape the imaginaries that are possible, that the ideas aren't coming just from their heads, right, but are coming from this whole series of this whole world that they are deeply enmeshed in, right, that has to do with funders and institutions and colleagues and the kind of outlets and the uptake of their ideas, the availability and access to other ideas, and all of the things that kind of make what I call a world of higher education. And then also the important part is that the ideas that are being produced within these particular sites also have an impact on the production of the worlds and the production of other imaginaries. So part of the story is to show how the ideas moved from, for example, the Center for International Studies or the Harvard Business School in the case of Theodore Levitt, and came to have practical and kind of be absorbed in the world around. Again, to kind of break down that notion that there's a university and a world that exists out there, but also that, and therefore that the story is not that the world, that the university is an institution that's being besieged by market forces, that's under attack by external influences, but also that the universities and the knowledge that's being produced there in these particular sites are also involved in the production and the reproduction of the world in general. So I'm almost out of time here, but let me just give you an example of chapter 3. So chapter 3 is a careful examination of this pivotal text called The Globalization of Markets that Theodore Levitt wrote in 1983. Theodore Levitt is a marketing guru within the Harvard Business School, and this chapter examines that essay, right, and demonstrates and situates it within his broader thinking about marketing in general, right? And at this time, the discipline of marketing, the idea that marketing is something that you could teach, the very idea that business schools were the places to go to learn how to be a business person. Prior to this, most business education was based on practice and being an apprentice. So the notion that there would be business schools was really accelerating in the 1980s. The emergence of Harvard Business School as a particularly important site in this new field, and then marketing as something that the Harvard Business School did particularly well and was particularly renowned for. And one of the reasons it was renowned was because of this guy Theodore Levitt, who's kind of this quirky, iconoclast marketing guru who would kind of make all of these kinds of big claims about what marketing is and what it could be and how it should be used. And so using that kind of thinking about business schools and the discipline of marketing and Levitt's previously work, I reread many times his essay, The Globalization of Markets. This is generally treated as, this article says that markets are global, and therefore this kind of becomes an early text in the globalization literature. But if you look through the kind of the broader context within which Levitt was writing, it becomes clear that he's not saying the worlds are global. He's not saying the world is, or markets are global. He's saying that that firms can be more successful, more generative if they imagine the world as if they were global, right? And so what he examines is that the tendency for corporations to imagine these national preferences among consumers, and he uses the example of the creation of a washing machine, right? So instead of creating a washing machine that was for a French market and a British market and an American market, what Levitt says in this article is that marketers should, or producers of washing machines should just assume that there is only one market for washing machines, and it should produce one commodity, and then it should market that commodity differently in France, the UK, and the US, and tell the consumers that this is the washing machine that they've always wanted, right? So instead of having different production facilities and different production runs, you produce the same thing and you tell people that it's the thing that they want, right? And basically in here, he uses all this language, including this notion of the world is flat, which Thomas Friedman would then borrow and not cite in his book The World is Flat, but basically kind of saying we should think about the world as if it was global. Now, this is like, there's a lot of articles about a lot of things that get published that kind of sit in journals and don't really go anywhere. So I think that it's really important to remember that Levitt didn't just write this and kind of put it on the shelf, right? That he circulated within a book that was called The Marketing Imagination. And in the archives of the Harvard Business School, he has extensive correspondence with all of the CEOs, business leaders, and government officials that he sent the book to. He personally had the book sent to, for example, the presidents of American Airlines, Bank of America, Coca-Cola, Firestone, Ford, General Mills, Monsanto, Nabisco, Washington Post, Woolworths, Barclays, Boston Globe, Citibank, Gulf Oil, IBM, and the list just goes on and on, dozens and dozens of others. He was very active in promoting this book. And he was also on the board of a advertising firm, Saatchi and Saatchi, which produced this very, very strange ad. I would Google it and watch it after this talk. Is absolutely bonkers, but it's it's an ad for British Airlines in which the island of Manhattan flies and lands in Heathrow Airport, right? So again, this idea of the world as being deeply interconnected, as being one space, and kind of imagining it as if it were, as if that were the case. And the thing that I find that's so interesting about Levitt's work is that in the 1980s, he's writing about here's how firms should be thinking about the world. In the 1990s, firms in the 80s and 90s, firms begin to adopt that type of strategy of thinking about the world as if it were global. And then in the 1990s and 2000s, the social scientists begin writing a whole literature about globalization, not recognizing that not all of, but that colleagues across their campus in the business school had actually been responsible for producing the knowledge that helped create the conditions in which marketing practices shift. So the phenomenon that was being studied in the social sciences was in part an effect of the knowledge that was being produced across campus in the business school. I have a little bit more to say, but let's just end on the example of NYU, which kind of which fleshes out the book. And as I mentioned before, NYU is just the perfect example of what happens when an institution kind of really embraces that notion of being global. So NYU is very particular in that it imagines itself under John Sexton as a global network university. So instead of being a university that's located in New York, it instead reimagined itself as a network, right? Where one portal was in New York, one portal was in Abu Dhabi, one portal was in Shanghai, and that these portals, the students can enter from any of these three portals and then take classes in any of those portals, plus any other dozens of their international sites that were study abroad. And in the chapter, I examined how NYU was really a pioneer of study abroad in the 1970s, largely as a result of its constraint in terms of real estate. It was very, very expensive to house students in New York. NYU was a local commuter school that had aspirations to become a wealthy school, but it had to compete with other institutions that had large endowments. So it became very, very aggressive in increasing the number of students. But in order to increase the number of students, it had to house them somewhere. And it quickly found that sending students abroad became a really successful way of being able to expand the number of students you're able to admit, while keep maintaining the not expanding the number of people that you have to find places to house in New York, right? And so this idea of a institution that's constrained by its physical location then became kind of an ethos within the institution. And I examined kind of how the Abu Dhabi campus kind of continues to embody that. So when NYU took the $1 billion+ from in order to build the campus, that in donations in order to build the campus, it largely talked about the importance of spreading democracy, of networking people from around the world, and people coming from all over the world into this spot in Abu Dhabi in order to share an experience. But it had no space to kind of comprehend or account for the kind of terrible labor conditions that went into the creation of that campus, or the kind of world around the campus itself. So again, imagining the university as kind of isolated and independent from the world around it. And I call this kind of, I go back to kind of John Sexton's Jesuit commitments, and kind of think about the kind of global imaginary that John Sexton embodies, is that of what I call an edu-theological imaginary, where higher education kind of exists in a sphere that's detached from the world around it. So it's a different type of kind of Archimedean point. Yeah, and so I think that kind of in conclusion, what I hope that my book does, I mean, I don't know if it does it, but I would hope that what it does is it allows for us to think about academic knowledge and the imaginaries embedded therein, and how they're produced within specific locations and sites. And then it raises questions about what kinds of organizations and knowledge is necessary to imagine the world otherwise. So kind of the big take home in the conclusion is, if knowledge is deeply embedded within the world, then it's not just enough to critique existing kinds of knowledge. We also have to build the kinds of institutions, to build the material sites in which alternative knowledges can also be produced and circulated. So that is what I got for now. I'm more than happy to talk and chat and whatnot.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Isaac. That was a great run through of your book, and I'm hoping people will go away and take it further and read it. For now, I think you've given us lots to sort of think about and talk through. One of the reasons I thought I wanted to have you do a webinar was because I think, even though this book is it came out in 2019, it helps us think about where we might have gone since then as well, and the sort of persistence of this imaginary. And the ways in which this imaginary has traveled as well, such that it's not as if the branch campus movement has sort of come to a halt. Ever more universities are imagining themselves, or want to imagine themselves, as Harvard. I wanted to ask a question. I really would like everyone to sort of join in and post questions in the chat. But if I could get going, you've structured it as a sort of series of engagements with particular intellectuals. Mm-hmm. And that totally makes sense, because those intellectuals, they become an index or a proxy for a way of imagining the world. What about the agency of the university itself, and or other forms of world making, like data? I mean, one could think about the OECD as a sort of world maker, in terms of enabling universities to compare their trajectories in terms of participation in higher education. Or you could, I mean, obviously you use NYU, but you could certainly think about certain entrepreneurial universities like Monash in Australia, which rode the tiger and sort of quickly sort of expanded themselves and marketed themselves as global universities. I mean, I wondered, how one balances that attention to individual ideologues as opposed to universities as ideas making.
Yeah. No, that's a great question. And I think that this comes it kind of comes from the theoretical kind of undergirding and this kind of being influenced, like thinking about Althusser's argument about ideological state apparatuses and this idea of he talks about the education apparatus, but he talks about the idea of relations and effects, right? That society that structures exist in terms of relations and effects. But at the same time, he's always interested in the role of the individual and the individual knowledge producer within those structures, right? So he'll talk about kind of how a world is structured. He doesn't use the language of world, but I think it's applicable, like how a world is structured, right? But then he's situating an individual theorists, right? Whether it's his book on Gramsci or his essays on Lenin, or think about Marx or Rousseau, or it's kind of looking at the kind of conjunctures within which certain knowledge is possible, right? So that certain ideas become possible under certain conditions, and that those ideas have effects because of the conditions that are structured around them. So what I wanted to do in a way of telling the story of individuals too, I think it also serves as a reflection of what is it that we can do, right? I think that this is something that is a limitation, and when you think of through structuralism, is that then it becomes a story of structures that exist out there. It becomes its own form of abstraction, its own form of kind of Archimedean point, in which we're all of a sudden examining the structures that exist out there. So telling the story through the individuals became a way of kind of demonstrating that, there's not this kind of like agent structure dichotomy in this kind of clear way, that structuralism still has this kind of, especially if you take it and you think about just the deep levels of complexity and contradiction that kind of produce the individual subjects, right? And that structures, that individuals do have a lot of kind of effects on those broader structures, right? So to kind of think about that, instead of just think about the World Bank or think about NYU as a kind of entity or institution, which I think is completely legitimate to do. What I'm trying to do is kind of think about, the role of the individual within a structure as a way of then opening the space of like, okay, I'm also an individual knowledge producer. How is it that I can think better about how to engage with those structures, and then to break down that kind of liberal assumption that the ideas that we produce go off and have lives, and have effects that are kind of independent of our intention, that all we're doing is just producing knowledge and throwing it out into the world. I think that that leads to kind of a really profound limitation, instead of also thinking about the material conditions that give rise to knowledge, and also just all the amazing ideas and books and articles that get written and produced and don't go anywhere, right? Just kind of like are there, and glad they're written, but they don't have that kind of effect. So thinking about the production of knowledge in terms of the conditions that give rise to it also having effects, right? And particularly effects on then the conditions of knowledge production itself in this instance. But it kind of serves, I think, as a kind of, an effort for us to say, oh, wait a minute, this is what it looks like, going into Theodore Levitt's archive and just seeing all of the work that he did to promote that essay. I mean, just, not only being at Harvard, not only being on boards, not only his kind of institution, but all the incredible work that went into kind of putting that argument in front of people who then could then take it up and apply it, right? And that, for me, that was just a real insight that, there's, Marx will say an idea becomes a real when it becomes absorbed by the roots, right? That it has to be absorbed. An idea itself has to be absorbed. And so it's kind of a way of thinking about how ideas are both produced, absorbed, and circulated. But that's
okay. That's very interesting. So I mean, perhaps for people who haven't read Althusser, I mean, my reading obviously was a bit sort of transitory, but I always thought of it as somehow an individual being interpolated by a state apparatus
Yeah,
through an ideology.
yeah,
So in this context, these individuals are both are contributing to those apparatuses
yeah,
and being interpolated. Is that right? So they're
yeah,
both making them
exactly.
and
Yeah.
okay.
So basically, I mean, in the example that Althusser uses in the ideological state apparatus, right, is that there's this idea of, instead of a human being or somebody, an individual having faith in God, right, and then God being this being that one believes in, right, that instead it's the very act of going into the church to stand, kneel, cross oneself, say certain words, sing certain songs, stand, kneel, and you do that over and over and over, and over time then one comes to have a faith in God. And I think that the analogy between that and globalization, the example of what takes place in the office writing about globalization, that's the kind of thing that I'm trying to try. The difference that I have, I think that Althusser is, he came to the US in particular at a particular time during the kind of ideological methods wars where structure meant certain things. I think that his more recently published stuff gives a much more nuanced understanding, and I think that I mean, I have this whole a thing about kind of reading Althusser differently. That there is this idea that there's like structure, there's individuals that are interpolated into it, and that there's not much space, right? There's just structures, and I don't think that. I can see why Althusser got read that way, and I think one can read that way. I think that the current conjuncture creates the conditions to think about and to read Althusser in a way that is much more open, and in which there's much more, where the structures are much more contradictory, right? In which there is not a kind of singularity that we're being interpolated into, but instead, this highly contradictory set of relations and effects that then creates space in which we could do something that looks more like acting strategically within a particular conjuncture. And for me, like what I appreciate about Althusser is it puts the material conditions at the center of the analysis without making it determinate, right? So a lot of the critiques of, say, academic capitalism or the university as knowledge factory or neoliberalization of higher education kind of have this logic of there is this force out there, capitalism, neoliberalism, elites, blah, 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 this like making universities become this one particular thing, right? And Althusser is like, no, 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 that's not how it works. And so I think that like, it this may be a misreading of Althusser, but I still kind of like it, so I'm going to run with it.
No, and I think it's really interesting you say we should go back and read it. I mean, this is not really a theory seminar, but I mean, you only have to look at the impact that his ideas had on cultural studies and a whole generation of critical thinking. So it's great to be reminded that actually this is a useful, and you've used it very effectively to help us think again. So that's really helpful, and I think I'm going to sort of try and run with that and see where it takes me. In terms of the complexity, as you say, we know we're not opposing structure and agent. We've got a question coming in. So going back to the empirical, really. Dawson, do you want to ask your question about transnational franchising?
Yeah.
Dawson, do you want to unmute and say hello? Lopez?
Hi there. Yeah,
Hi,
this
welcome.
is me.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you for allowing me to ask. My question is about the currently more and more spread around the world the practice of having universities. I mean, big names like the NYU and other ones like Sorbonne or other big brands, world brands that are spreading over the Middle East and Southeast Asia. How do you see this practice?
Yeah. That's a great question. I mean, I think that for me, it really, um, the I mean, I think that it's tied to like this really profound and I think deeply disturbing kind of reconceptualization of what education is, right? And the thing that the NYU example is, so it was what I think is at stake, right? Is that NYU in New York means certain things for the people who live in that area and who attend the campus and are engaged in the kinds of struggles that NYU is a part of. So in the chapter, I look at like the graduate student union drive and the protests that were pushing back on NYU's expansion. But what you get is this kind of, the university as a space where real people are contesting and also sharing and expanding and thinking together, right? And I think that there's a whole bunch of reasons why that vision of the university is kind of, I think, being increasingly emaciated, right? And that has to do with, financial demand, but also I think it has to do with this kind of broader kind of pressure for universities to be like like that idea that every school now has to be a Harvard, right? Is that there is this thing that universities are aspiring to do to become something that they're not, right? And this kind of incredible pressure that leads to homogeneity, but then also leads to this kind of incredible kind of demand for resources. I think that's the story of NYU, like really trying to get the kinds of resources that are necessary to compete with schools that have centuries of generational wealth kind of in their endowment. And so what you do is you kind of creating this mechanism whereby it becomes completely normalized to think about universities and education as itself a commodity. And that's kind of the chapter on Clausen. I look at the rise of kind of human capital thinking, right? Where university education, when it was tied to the national imaginary, was very much about government saying, and the World Bank saying, we don't know the value that a university provides, can't measure it. We know that there's long-term positive effects. We know that. We can't measure it. But we're committed to it. We know it's important, and therefore we're going to fund it. And then in the 1980s and the rise of human capital out of the Chicago School of Economics, this idea that higher education is actually a private good. It's not a national good. It's not like nations fund it. It becomes a private good that an individual decides that, and that you can actually measure it based on future income. So the value of a degree is my future income minus my current income, right? And that's the value of that degree. So individuals can make that decision of, okay, I'm going to invest in a degree. And if the individual is the beneficiary of that, then it makes sense to make the individual pay. And so that whole language of higher education as becoming a commodity just become totally normalized, and leads to this whole normalization of student debt as the way to fund higher education, the defunding of government funding, because now if you understand it as a private, and then so what I think that we're seeing now is this kind of like branding stuff and branch and campuses is just a further extension that becomes even more abstracted, right? Where the thing that's being produced is not even human capital per se, but now you have a degree, or you have the symbols, the status symbols and stuff like that. And so I think that there's something that's really fundamental that's going on about the kind of the transformations that are taking place within capitalism. And there's also the incredible financial pressures that schools are under, and the ways in which the notion that a university can just be a space where people get together and produce knowledge and think about stuff, and that's good enough. I mean, that's not only good enough, that's amazing. Right? That is like the pinnacle of what human beings can and should be doing, and that could take place in all kinds of places. That could be a community college, or it could be Harvard, or it could be the Sorbonne, in its branch campus and wherever, right? That and so the kind of there's this kind of increasingly remove of higher education from the materiality, and it becomes increasingly financialized, and so the branding of a school, the franchising of a school and branch campuses just kind of becomes a way of in the same way that finance is becoming increasingly financialized and abstracted. I think education is following the same route. So.
Great, thanks Isaac and Lopez. Thank you for opening that up. Lee, welcome, Lee. Lee's, I know you've worked on transnational education yourself, Lee, but you've got a great question. Do you want to come forward and
great? Yes. Hi, Isaac. Yeah, I'm really listening excitedly, intently here. This is a really enjoyable And I know you've I was working on my question, which kind of dovetailed on from David's about agency. And in that process, I think that your last question more or less touched on a lot of things I was going to ask you. But so just wanted to put out there about how your structural-ish reading of imaginaries of globalization, how does that run up against affect and the production of affect?
Yeah.
You know, when I was thinking about the way I've experienced T&E in the UAE, transnational education in the UAE, so much of it is sustained on the circulation of affect and selling this idea of desiring a certain cosmopolitan subjectivity that you know, you just see, and as you said, a lot of it is branding, but it's all the global university, the global this, the global that, and in some ways it's so ethereal. It fits this idea of an imaginary because it's never actually achievable in a lot of ways, especially where students who purchase this then actually run up against the materiality, the realities of say border regimes, and find that they are themselves maybe not as global as they saw themselves, despite now having some kind of cosmopolitan capital. So I just want to ask you what you make of that.
That's a really great question. And in a way, I think, you know, there's a, I mean, so the chapter on NYU is really interesting in that John Sexton, President Sexton, would talk about what NYU provides as an ecumenical gift, right? So this idea that NYU is providing the gift of knowledge to the world, right? That it's entering this new axial age of global cosmopolitanism, and NYU is going to be the vessel that brings about this, you know, that provides this gift to the world, right? So there really is this just like absolute fantasy about what education is. And I think that like it's hyperbolic in the case of NYU, but I think that most colleges and universities now speak in this way, right? Where the thing that is being cultivated is this kind of feeling of what it means to be a global citizen, right? And, you know, in a way, I think that I was, you know, the project is very much framed as knowledge production. And in a way, I think that that is still kind of tied into my own, it's tied into a very kind of, you know, taking the university at its word about what it's doing in terms of producing knowledge, right? But I think that there's actually the university and universities do lots of different things. I think it's really important to kind of hold that, like, as scholars of higher education, we tend to think of the university as an object of study. Like there's the university, what is the university? How does it function, right? But in fact, there is no such thing as the university. There's lots of different kinds of institutions that do lots of different things. And so I think that in thinking about all of the kinds of things that universities do, right? You know, they're of course like landowners, they're, you know, agents of imperialism, they all this, but they're also, I think you're absolutely right. Like they produce a knowledge, but they also produce affect. And, you know, in lots of ways, you know, I'm telling like a grand story. I'm telling the story of like, and they produce knowledge, right? But, you know, in the US, they produce like football, you know, and like knowledge may actually in lots of cases be, you know, secondary, right? So I think that it's, you know, but I also do think that the language of production and reproduction might also be helpful in thinking about affect, right? So how is it that, you know, and I don't know the literature. I don't study affect, but I think that what I like about the kind of the idea of relations and effects and the production that's taking place in a structure-ish. I love that term. That's so great. I had one reviewer that accused the book of being too structuralist or not structuralist enough. And I was like, I think I nailed it, right? And so basically, is that, you know, the logic of production and reproduction, it could be knowledge, but I think it could also be affect. Like what are the material conditions that make it possible for students to feel like they are a cosmopolitan citizen, right? And so what, like a community college, you know, in Hartford, Connecticut may not have the same material conditions to be able to do that as NYU does, right? And to kind of think about those asymmetries and what they're doing, and then also what is being done by that affect, like you mentioned, and what's part of the book, chapter 2, is that affect, about kind of being a global citizen, then hides all the very material violence that NYU Abu Dhabi has done in its immediate neighborhood, both in New York and in Abu Dhabi. So yeah, I love that language of affect. I wish I had framed that knowledge production bit more expansively than just knowledge. So yeah, that's great question. Thanks, I really appreciate that.
That's great, Lee. Do you want to come back at all, or add anything? No. So I think that's really interesting. I think you're right that there is this incredible way in which universities are making us feel global, and that's part of the marketing, and that's why the international student mobility carries on, and why it's structured as it is. And even where there's sort of marginal mobility to the semi-peripheries, it's still the same logic of hoping to somehow have a bit of the global rubs off on you somehow or other.
There's a professor that I really admire, Premish Lalu, in University of the Western Cape in South Africa, and there was Premish wanted to make the argument that University of the Western Cape should market itself as the University of Apartheid, right? If you want to understand apartheid, right, which is an essential project for post-apartheid South Africa, you have to understand what apartheid was, how it functioned, all of that. Then University of the Western Cape should brand itself as the institution where people from around the world could come and really understand the apartheid system. And this would be a form of knowledge that UWC was uniquely positioned to provide, right? And this was at a time in which, the World Bank and global donors and the metrics regimes and all of that was like the universities, the South African universities were like, and we are global too, right? In the most generic and banal way, we too can compete as global universities. And I always use like Premish's vision as like a really brilliant example of how universities could be imagined otherwise in order to do certain kinds of work that can't be done if the default is we're a global institution, right? It's so boring, right? It's false and it's boring, right? So.
Well, if there's any consolation, I was in UWC last October, and we did go on a campus tour, and we went to the front line where the constant barricading of students and shootings happened, and to this room that was somehow the parliament for the coloured, that term was used for the community. So there is, they actually are absolutely sort of cleaving to that vision, which I think is absolutely right. Look, we're going to have to run out. We're going to have to wind up, I think. Isaac, it's been really great having you. You've given us lots to think about, and you'll have to come back and tell us about AAP's Centre for Academic Freedom, because that would be really interesting as well at some point. But for now, I hope you've enjoyed talking to us, and we'd love to read more and think more with you.
Absolutely.
Okay, everybody, just to let you know, sorry, say what you're going to say, Isaac.
No, just anytime. I'm happy to carry on this conversation. It seems like these is good people in the room.
Good. Well, do come back, everyone. Next week, Lee and is convening a whole panel, double length seminar on transnational education, the geopolitics of. So we're going to be carrying on talking exactly about some of these questions that we've begun to raise today. So that's 2 p.m. next Tuesday, UK time. In the meantime, thanks everyone for coming. And if you want to listen again, it's on our website. Good. Lovely to meet you, Isaac. See you again soon.
Yeah, a real pleasure. Cheers.
Bye-bye.